The music of the waves' repetitive smash against the rocky cliffs blended with the wind's melancholy scream. The ancient lighthouse, with its aged stone walls streaked with age and salt, stood resolutely on the edge of a barren cliff. It was a beacon of warning and comfort, a steady beam of light that swept across the vast ocean and pierced the misty night. The lighthouse was no longer inhabited. Rumors of unusual incidents, like lights flashing on quiet nights, whispers borne by the wind, and individuals spotted pacing the tower at ungodly hours, had drove the last residents of the surrounding village away decades ago. Although no keeper had been officially assigned for years, the lighthouse's beam never wavered. The fog was particularly heavy tonight, hanging like a spectral shroud over the cliffs. There was a slight metallic tinge to the moist, heavy air. A slight glow came from the lighthouse's base, as though the building itself were alive and breathing with the light's pulse. The fog lights hum. Wearing a heavy coat to protect themselves from the freezing cold, a lone figure stood at the edge of the cliff. The lighthouse has always appealed to Emma because of its lonesome beauty and constant watchfulness. But today, a shiver ran up her back as she stared at the whirling light. It seemed for the first time that the light was observing her rather than merely sweeping across the horizon. Emma has heard tales of the lighthouse since she was a child. She had grown up spending summers with her grandma in their small cottage at the edge of the forest in the now desolate village. Emma had frequently received warnings from her grandma, who was a strong believer in the paranormal, to avoid the lighthouse. She would reply in a deep, solemn voice, "It's not just a beacon for ships. It serves as a bridge, a doorway between our world and something else." Naturally, Emma had written those warnings off as fantasy. However, as she became older, she found it impossible to ignore the odd happenings that appeared to accompany the lighthouse. She would hear a soft, musical humming coming from the tower's direction on evenings when the fog drifted in heavy and thick. Despite the fact that the lighthouse had been officially retired for years, she had once seen what she believed to be a figure standing in the lantern room. Years later, Emma was compelled to return to the community. She was left with the little dilapidated cottage and a lifetime of memories after her grandma went away. Emma, who had lived in the city for years, had come back to the shore in search of peace and clarity. But the memories and the uneasiness came flooding back the closer she got to the lighthouse. The village was a shadow of what it had been. The majority of the houses had been destroyed by the weather. Their windows were broken and their roofs had collapsed. The cobblestone streets were being overtaken by spreading ivy and wild grasses, as nature started to reclaim the area. As though defying time, only the lighthouse was unaltered, its beam maintaining its ceaseless sweep. Emma had gotten used to the strange silence during her first few nights in the cabin. Except for the distant roar of the ocean and the sporadic creak of the cottage settling, the nights were long and silent. On the third night, however, she was unable to fall asleep, since her mind kept returning to the lighthouse. After grabbing a flashlight and her coat, she ventured out into the chilly night. As she headed near the cliff, the fog was thicker than normal and swirled about her feet. Ahead, the lighthouse loomed, its arcs of light piercing the mist. As she got closer, she heard something she had never noticed before, a steady, low hum coming from the tower's base. It didn't sound like the ocean, nor was it mechanical. It was almost like a song. When she arrived to the lighthouse's base, her steps faltered. Once rusted shut, the ancient iron door now hung slightly open, letting in a small amount of darkness. Emma's heart began to race. She was aware that she needed to turn around, go back to the cottage for safety, and lock the door after herself. However, she was drawn forward by an unstoppable force. The metallic taste was stronger and the air was cooler inside. Ancient graffiti, some of which had been worn beyond recognition, dotted the walls. With every step, creaking under her weight, the spiral staircase extended upward into the darkness. The hum became clearer, louder as she rose, echoing through her bones. She stopped when she got to the lantern room. The enormous glass lens turned slowly, creating unsettling reflections on the walls as its light moved. However, she wasn't focused on the light. It was the person with their back to her, standing near the lens. The figure, dressed in what looked like an antique keeper's outfit, stood still with its head cocked slightly as though it were listening to something. Emma's throat tightened with breath. She opened her lips to say something, but the figure turned before she could say anything. Its face was hidden, as if a thick shadow held onto it, preventing its features from being seen in the light. However, like embers in a fading fire, its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed dimly. The M intensified to the point where Emma thought the room itself was whirling for a split second. Then everything became motionless. Emma staggered back, her flashlight falling from her hand and hitting the ground with a clatter. The luminous eyes of the figure in the keeper's outfit stared at her without moving. She experienced a sudden chill, as though the warmth in the air had been removed. Her feet were fixed to the ground as though restrained by an unseen power, defying her desire to run. The whole lantern room seemed to be filled with the humming, which had now become a low, resonant thrum. It had evolved from a sound to a presence that pressed into her head and probed her thoughts. Emma tried to ignore it by closing her eyes, but the feeling only got worse. Her thoughts flickered with fragments of images, ships lost in the waves, storms roaring over a black sea, and the lighthouse standing as the only eyewitness to it all. Her voice, low and resonant, as though emanating from the walls themselves, murmured, "You shouldn't be here." The figure vanished as Emma's eyes opened. With the lens turning gently and directing its brightness into the misty night, the lantern room was deserted. She briefly believed she had dreamed it all. However, she saw the floor beneath her feet was wet, as though someone had just walked over it, leaving a path of seawater. When she leaned to get her flashlight, Emma rushed down the spiral staircase, her heart racing. She looked back up when she arrived at the base of the tower, half expecting to see the figure looking down at her. Rather, the beam of light flickered once and then returned to its steady pattern. The uneasiness stuck to her like a second skin as she went outside and breathed in the briny night air. Emma started looking into the lighthouse's past because she was determined to understand what she had witnessed. The following morning, she went to the nearby town's tiny library, which was one of the few remaining establishments. When Emma brought up the lighthouse, Margaret, the librarian, an elderly woman, appeared taken aback. Margaret said, "No one talks about that place anymore. However, the archives contain old records if you're searching for answers." The records pages were yellowed and curled at the edges, making them fragile with age. Emma combed through them, trying to piece together the history of the lighthouse. It was constructed more than a century ago with the intention of safely navigating the hazardous waters for ships. However, its reputation had gotten darker over time. The keepers had disappeared, their possessions unaltered. Despite the light's guiding, ships had sunk and their crews were never located. Then came the sightings, that eerie hum, disembodied voices, and shadowy figures. She was interested in one account. It was written in the early 1900s by a keeper named Elias Gray and told of a stormy night when the light had mysteriously gone out. Like Emma, Elias said he saw a person in the lantern chamber, its eyes blazing like coals, the same humming which he characterized as a coal. A lure for the unwary had been heard by him. The final, terrifying entry marked the abrupt conclusion of Elias's journal. "The light is not ours to command. It waits and observes. It also takes what it requires." Emma closed the notebook with shaking hands. Her concerns were confirmed when the remarks struck a chord with her personal experience. The lighthouse was alive, a separate thing, not merely haunted. It had also taken notice of her. She had a dream about the lighthouse that night. She was standing in the lantern room in her dream, the light beam spreading across a black, unending ocean. The figure stood there, staring at her with luminous eyes. However, it spoke this time in a chorus of whispers, saying, "Come, be a part of the light." The whispers from her dream were still reverberating in Emma's head as she woke up. The only source of light in the room was the constant pulse of the lighthouse's beam that came in through the window. She lay there for a minute, contemplating whether to stay or to run. However, she secretly understood that running wouldn't be beneficial. She couldn't leave so easily because of whatever was in the lighthouse. Emma hurriedly put on her clothes and picked up her flashlight, determined to face the reality. As though the house itself were holding its breath, the cottage appeared uncanny quiet, devoid of the typical creaks and groans. The fog outside was thicker than ever, around her like a living creature. With each step she took, the buzz from the tower became louder as she followed the narrow route to the lighthouse. As she arrived at the lighthouse's base, the entrance was ajar, perhaps beckoning her inside. The air was wet and acrid, colder than before. The spiral staircase became brighter as her flashlight beam pierced the night. She didn't hesitate this time. As she climbed, her footfall reverberated, but the sound was soon lost in the deafening silence. Emma froze as she arrived at the lantern chamber. Once more, the figure stood behind the large lens with its back to her. It was hard to concentrate because of the weird, broken reflections the light created all over the room. Emma, however, made herself take a step forward. "Who are you?" Her voice was steady but shaking as she requested. It took a while for the figure to turn. Rather, it lifted one hand and made contact with the lens, leaving the glass with thin lines of condensation. At last, it spoke, a deep, resonant murmur that seemed as if it were coming straight from the walls. It said, "I am the keeper. You are too." Emma's throat tightened with breath. Slowly, the person turned and her face was visible again, clearly her own. From the slight scar on her face to the terror in her eyes, everything was the same. However, the doppelganger's flaming eyes softened to a gentle, golden tint, and its attitude was placid, even calm. "This location makes its own decisions," it added. "The light must always shine. It needs a soul to anchor it, a guide." Emma backed away and shook her head. "No, I'm not going to stay here. This place doesn't belong to me." "Huh? Wait." With a slight smile on its lips, the doppelganger cocked its head. "As soon as you got back, you were picked. Have you not sensed it? You have been claimed by the light, the droll, the dreams." The hum grew louder until Emma could hear nothing else in the room. The air itself vibrated with a low, resonant power, and the walls appeared to pulse with electricity. Emma resisted the doppelganger's advances, holding on to her flashlight as if it were a lucky charm. With a firmer voice, she declared, "I won't stay. My life is not this. I will not allow it to happen." The smile faded as the figure came to a stop. The hum stopped for a second, and the room became eerily quiet. The light in the lens then flashed spectacularly, with a sudden burst of wind dazzling Emma and making her hide her eyes. The room was deserted as the light faded. The hum had disappeared, and so had the doppelganger. Emma stood by herself as the large lens steadily rotated, illuminating the night with its beam. However, something had changed. The heavy weight had been lifted, and the air felt lighter. Her thoughts were racing as she slowly made her way down the stairs. She stopped at the base of the tower and glanced back up at the light. It felt, for the first time, serene, as though the lighthouse itself had recognized her disobedience. However, Emma heard a faint voice carried by the wind as she went outside. "The light always needs a keeper." The murmuring hum followed her as she ran back to the cottage, her heart racing, a reminder that although she had temporarily escaped, the lighthouse was still behind her. 2. Emma opened her eyes to the sound of the waves, whose calming pattern was accentuated by an unexplained sense of urgency. Warm light filled her tiny room as the morning sun came in through the window. She experienced the weight of her dream briefly vanishing, as if it were sand passing through her fingers. However, she was reminded that it was not a typical nightmare by the persistent buzzing in her ears. Elias Gray's journal and his foreboding caution that the light is not ours to command came into her mind. She had been deeply affected by those comments, which resonated with an unsettling reality. Not only was the lighthouse haunted, but it was also sentient, an old creature confined to its constant watch. Emma made the decision to leave the community because she was determined to break free from its control. Her movements were methodical but tinged with uneasiness as she packed quickly. She stopped to look out the window as she packed her luggage with her grandmother's treasured possessions. With an almost hypnotic pattern, the lighthouse's glow swept over the rocks as it loomed in the distance. However, a gentle tap reverberated throughout the cottage as she turned to go. There was nobody. Once again the fog had crept in thick, shrouding the scene in gray. As Emma went outside, her heartbeat accelerated. Her gaze landed on the ground, a solitary, wet, shiny footprint that led to the lighthouse. Emma fought the temptation to follow, but something inside her told her otherwise. "No," she said in a low voice, "I'm not returning." "Diude." The hum became weak, scarcely perceptible, but continued until she locked the door behind her. Every step felt heavier as Emma carried her bag to the car, as if invisible eyes were observing her departure. The eerie silence was broken as she turned on the ignition, causing the engine to roar to life. As she drove off, the lighthouse's light dimmed against the fog and vanished from the rearview mirror. There were overgrown woods and abandoned ruins of the village along the lengthy, winding road ahead. But as the distance between her and the lighthouse grew, an odd serenity descended upon her. There was no longer any buzz. Emma let out a breath and relaxed her hold on the steering wheel. Refusing to allow the shadow of the lighthouse to remain in her mind, she avoided turning around. As she continued to drive, the anxiety subsided and was replaced with a cautious sensation of relief. The sun had risen completely by the time she arrived at the edge of the closest town, and the rooftops were bathed in golden light. After pulling into a peaceful parking area, Emma got out and stood for a while, allowing the warmth to permeate her body. The light never forgets, however, was a faint murmur that drifted past her ear as she closed her eyes. Emma shivered and turned, but all she could hear was the quiet murmur of morning activity and the busy streets of the town. She assured herself that it was ended and she was no longer in the lighthouse's clutches, but she knew in her heart that it would be there, waiting and observing. A keeper was constantly needed for the light. Once again, the steady, unwavering light of the lighthouse beam pierced the encroaching dusk. Emma's bright eyes reflected the unending light as she gazed out across the horizon from her spot inside the lantern room. "The light never forgets, and it never sleeps," was spoken in the stillness and carried by the wind.